Lions head coach Matt Patricia says he did not sexually assault a woman in 1996 while on spring break in Texas. Patricia, who was 21 at the time, was arrested along with an RPI football teammate and indicted by a grand jury. The charges were dismissed after the woman refused to testify at trial. The case came to light in Wednesday's edition of the Detroit News. Patricia addressed the incident Thursday.
There was a grand jury indictment. Can you explain why you actually were indicted, even though charges were dropped?
Again, I was accused of something that I did not do. I went through the process and the case was dismissed.
Were you in the room with the girl? Was there consensual sex? Was there anything that went on between you?
Again, I did nothing wrong, and that's all I'm going to say on that matter.
Do you regret not disclosing this to the Detroit Lions? Is this something you've ever disclosed to anyone yet?
Like I said before, I've interviewed for a lot of jobs, and again, interviewing for jobs in engineering right after the situation happened, it was never an issue. It never came up as anything because it was dismissed and I was innocent.
The NFL releasing the following statement saying, "We will review the matter with the club to understand the allegations and what the club has learned." For more on this, let's get you back to First Take.
Lions head coach Matt Patricia saying he was innocent then and he is innocent now. We welcome Will Kane back to the debate desk. And Max, before I kick things out to you, just as the female on the show, I want to say this quickly. If Matt Patricia did sexually assault this woman, of course, I do not think he should be head coach of the Lions. I don't care if it happened 20 years ago. I don't care if it's an isolated incident. He should not be leading men. And I also want to say shame on the Lions for not being aware of this information. They need to do a better job vetting their coaching candidates in the same vein that they would in the draft process and how they would investigate their players and draftees. And lastly, I think Matt could have also been more transparent here. I think it's unwise that he didn't bring this information to light, especially considering the times that we're in.
Before Max chimes in, I'd like to respond directly to something that you just said,
Sure.
Molly. Shame on the Lions?
Yes.
Well, he's been working for the Patriots for years.
You know what, Stephen A., you're right. Yeah, you're right there. Shame on the Patriots as well.
I'm just saying, the point is that it's entirely plausible that this coach has been working for the Patriots for years. The Lions might have said, okay, I'm vetting him. He was with the Patriots, 5-time champions. There's been no problem in his background. So you go ahead and you hire the guy without any knowledge of this whatsoever.
You're 100% right.
I mean, I look at the Patriots before I look at the Patriots before I look at the Lions. But go ahead, Max.
I'd look at both of them. Max?
I said before. Right.
Sexual assault is always and without exception, and I can't believe this even needs to be said, but maybe it does, unacceptable. It's never okay. And false accusations are also always unacceptable, never okay. And we simply don't have the facts in this case, and it happened 22 years ago. So the difficulty in discussing it publicly, the content, the stuff that actually did or didn't happen, is that there's been such a culture of victim shaming that people are hesitant to say, hey, wait a minute, this turned out to be, the charges were, he was indicted, but the charges were dropped. And so he was exonerated in that way. Because you want to be very careful about someone who's making an accusation. What if it's true? Because the legal system, it's a process. And we should wait till the facts come out and respect the process, but it's imperfect. It doesn't always come to a correct conclusion. And we also need to be equally careful about dragging someone's name through the mud, in this case, Matt Patricia's, because the charges were dropped. And if it was a false accusation, that's also completely unacceptable. And we need to be careful in our being careful not to victim shame or to blame an accuser. We need to be careful also not to just simply accept every accusation and assume, well, wait a minute, there was an indictment, therefore where there's smoke, there's fire. No, there's a legal process. And the charges were dropped against Patricia. Given the time that it took place 22 years ago, given the fact that the charges were dropped, and given the fact that we simply don't have the facts in the case, we don't have all the information, I think it is what's happening to Patricia now is unfair. And I don't I don't like. I think he should keep his job with the Lions, and I don't know what other conclusion one can reach here.
Go ahead, Will.
Before I jump in on what I think and my takeaway from this is, I think, issues like this one and the conversations like we're about to have need to have back and forth. So if I may, just quickly, I'd like to address the things you said, Molly, and if you forgive me, I tried to write them down, and I think I missed number 2. But
sure.
First of all, on number one, you said if Matt Patricia is guilty of sexual assault, even going back 22 years, and even when you're 21 years old, he shouldn't hold the job that he has now. He shouldn't be leaders of men. I agree with you.
Yes. Yep. Okay.
And I think most would. I think most would agree with you that if that's the case, he shouldn't be holding the job he has today. But the if carries so much weight. If he's guilty of it. And that's what Max just went on to talk about. On your third item, Molly, and you spoke on this as well, Stephen A., shame on the Lions, shame on the Patriots. I just want to add a little context to this. In the state of Massachusetts, it's illegal for an employer to ask a prospective employee about arrests, even charges that don't end up in convictions. So you can't sit around and say, hey, have you ever been arrested for a felony? However, in the state of Michigan, you can ask that. The federal law suggests you shouldn't ask that. You shouldn't ask people about things they have not been convicted of. And that brings me to what my big takeaway is.
Will, before you give us your big takeaway, though, because here's where I would challenge that, is with a quick Google search, from what I understand from reading multiple articles, you could find this information. So I see what these players that are potentially drafted and the scrutiny they're put under, and all their dirty laundries aired out. Even the Ezekiel Elliott in that situation, he was never arrested of any of these charges. They're able to find all, and I realize that's Ohio State. This was at RPI. This is 22 plus years ago. I get the whole deal. But I'm saying they can be investigating on their own, and they should have been able to find this information.
No doubt. Molly, and I saw the article on Deadspin that they found the indictment within a 30-second Google search.
Yeah.
I've seen this. But here's my big challenge to you, and this gets to my big takeaway. What do you do with the information when you find it? Because right now, I believe in society, certainly in football, definitely in the NFL, and all throughout Hollywood, entertainment, in our entire society, we don't know what to do right now with allegations. We don't know what to do with charges. In Matt Patricia's case, we don't know what to do with indictments. In other words, what do we do when somebody is alleged to have done something but not convicted? See, I'm very, very honestly, and I've done this consistently and had this conversation with all of you, I'm very uncomfortable with, well, he was accused to have done something 22 years ago, 2 years ago, I don't care. But he was never proven. Therefore, should he not get the job? What conclusion do you want to get to with that allegation? What do we do? I believe, by the way, if this had come out a month ago, he wouldn't have the job. That doesn't, I think he should, but I believe the public outcry would be such that the Detroit Lions probably would have run from it. But is that what we're doing? Is that what we're getting to? That allegation is indictment, indictment is conviction, that Matt Patricia shouldn't have gotten the job, and now, by the way, does he lose it? I'm very uncomfortable where we are as far as what weight an allegation carries.
Well, my response is that I agree with all three of you. There are the points that all three of you made in this particular situation match with what he was pointing to about being careful, because just because it's an allegation doesn't make it so. Molly, all the valid points that you made in terms of frowning upon those who may have employed him without having any indication whatsoever that this was in his background. Clearly, that's a situation that needs to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. And Will Kane, what you brought up about, from a federal perspective, this is not even allowable to ask. But in the state of Michigan, it could have been asked. Those are all incredibly valid points that I don't think can be ignored, and I applaud all three of you all for coming up with that. But this is the kind of stuff that's on my mind as it pertains to it as well. I'll add it to this from this perspective. I'm reading an article from the Detroit Free Press in which the district attorney at the time from Cameron County in Texas, remember, he was charged, ultimately indicted, but the charges were dismissed 5 months later because the alleged victim changed her mind about testifying. And then I read this quote from that district attorney at the time. We run into this often. And when something like this happens, we as prosecutors feel that the wrong message is sent out. So in other words, the guy is guilty. We believe he's guilty, but unfortunately he gets away with it because somebody decided not to testify. We understand that's a very real issue as it pertains to issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and beyond. And certainly nobody is trying to diminish that in any way. I'm saying that to all three of you and our nationally televised audience. But to piggyback off of what Max is saying, in the same breath, there are people who lie. In the same breath, there are some people who don't give all the information, and sometimes the accusations are false. So when we talk about allegations or we talk about accusations, and ultimately the case gets dropped, but then you allow somebody to be convicted in the court of public opinion. The fact that it's 22 years later resonates with me. If you're a prosecutor and this case is going on right now, and this man becomes the head coach, and you had to drop the case, and you speak about it in that moment, I totally get that. But 22 years ago, when somebody was a college student, not to excuse his actions, if indeed he is guilty of such a thing, because his behind should have been in jail if he's guilty of such a thing. But for it to be brought up 22 years later, when there's been no conviction, now we've got ourselves a problem here, because that means all of us get to sit back and worry about somebody making an accusation and that being enough to strip us of career opportunities that could ultimately compromise our quality of life, that of our families, and beyond, and based on something we don't even know is true. And for the prosecutor at that particular time to stick his nose back into the equation and to imply that there's a strong level of guilt here off of a case he couldn't even see through for whatever reason, and in this particular case, it was her unwillingness to testify. I just have a hard time, really. I'm not talking about the alleged victim. I'm talking about people on the outside, the prosecutors and others, being able to contribute to convicting somebody in a court of public opinion just because you couldn't get them in a court of law. There's a problem with that.
Can I ask you this? Do you think it was newsworthy? Do you think the Detroit Free Press's article 22 years later is newsworthy to bring up today?
I think it's newsworthy because of the point you pointed out, Will. The point that you pointed out, that it's a question that could be asked in the state of Michigan. The fact that you brought up being the lawyer that you are, the trained lawyer that you are, bringing up that nugget of information is incredibly important. If this were federal and it was in a state where you were not allowed to ask that question, no. But because it could have been asked, and it's allowable in the state of Michigan. And Molly pointed out, and you pointed out, that Deadspin highlighted, you could Google it and have it in a matter of minutes. The fact that that wasn't probed into by the Detroit Lions gives me cause to pause.
I think it's newsworthy as well. I think it's worthy of being written about. Some think, why bring it up if there's no conclusion? I think people need to be trusted with the facts, right? This is a fact. It's a fact that Matt Patricia was arrested. It's a fact that he was charged, and it's a fact that he was indicted. It's also a fact that he wasn't convicted. We need to be responsible consumers enough to be able to internalize that. And I guess, and Molly, this goes back, and Max did it with the first thing he said. Max did it with the first thing he said because it feels like it has to be reiterated. You can believe two things after you internalize these facts: that there's a problem with sexual assault, also with sexual harassment, and it should not be tolerated. But that lack of tolerance should not carry over to believing every allegation and convicting and firing based upon all allegations. Those you can hold both of those things.
Of course. And I
go ahead, Max.
Yeah, go.
Our legal protections, and Will, I think this addresses your concern that you voiced earlier. The legal protection, the idea of the presumption of innocence, we may wonder, or I think it's fair to kind of connect that idea to the fact that I think there's often publicly a presumption of guilt, and we need that the kind of legal safeguard for the accused of a presumption of innocence, because we understand human nature is to presume guilt on some level. If there's a charge, there's a sense where there's smoke, there's fire. Matt Patricia is claiming there is none. It was a false accusation, and we simply don't have the facts in the case to argue it one way or another, and so I do not think it should affect his employment.
Go ahead, Molly.
Lastly, I was going to say this, Will, when you say, like, what's the end game here? I think the end game's truth for the falsely accused and for the victims, which is clearly, we know how difficult that is to find.
I agree. Well, I totally agree, Molly, and that's why That's why I don't fault the Detroit Free Press for dredging up a 22-year-old story.
And
the only question,
Neither do
Molly,
I.
is we don't know the truth.
One thing I want to add to, I
had a question, Molly.
Yeah.
I had a question for you.
Yeah.
I had a question for you. When you say truth, how do you get to that? Because if the prosecutor has his interpretation.
I know.
Even if the alleged victim has her interpretation, Matt Patricia's on the record saying he's innocent. He is not guilty of this. He could not have been more emphatic about his innocence. He uttered those words. I'm innocent. I did not do this. So how do we find the truth 22 years later?
I wish I had the answer to that, and unfortunately, yes, it's a long time ago, 3 sides to every story. The other thing I wanted to add, too, because when we initially discussed this on the conference call, I had assumed it was the victim who spoke out on this, and it wasn't. As you mentioned, it was the Detroit Free Press who broke this story. So we'll leave it there. Will, appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Coming up after the break, we have breaking news out of Toronto on the future of Dwayne Casey. Stay right here.